the collector of teeth. I woke up choking on a coppery taste. My first instinct was to run my tongue across my teeth, to make sure they were all there. But the moment I did, I felt a gap. A jolt of panic shot down my spine. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. When I slid out of bed and turned on the lamp, I saw a spatter of blood on the sheets. My pillow looked like a crime scene. I ran to the bathroom mirror, my heart pounding so fiercely I could feel it in my throat. I opened my mouth and discovered one of my premolars was missing. The gum around it looked torn, as if something had ripped it out during the night. Nausea overwhelmed me, and my reflection blurred as tears filled my eyes. At first, I told myself it had to be some freak accident. Maybe I'd ground my teeth so hard I'd dislodged one. But deep down, it felt too violent, too invasive. No ordinary dental mishap could leave so much blood. Even as I fumbled for a tissue to stanch the bleeding, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone, or something, had been in my room. That morning, I tried to call my dentist, but the line rang endlessly. With a fresh wave of anxiety, I decided to head to his clinic in person. As I stepped outside, the autumn wind stung my face. It carried a faint, unsettling odor, like rotting leaves mixed with something metallic. I couldn't tell if it was the taste of my own blood or the promise of something far more sinister. On my way to the dentist's office, I noticed my neighbor, Mrs. Montoya, pressing an ice pack to her jaw. She looked at me with swollen eyes, despair etched into every line on her face. I wanted to ask if she, too, was missing a tooth, but the words lodged in my throat, and I passed her in silence. I had no idea that this was just the beginning. None of us yet realized that something truly horrifying lurked in our midst. Something stalking our quiet streets at night and leaving behind empty, bleeding gums as its calling card. Despite my panic, the dentist's office was almost empty when I arrived. A single receptionist sat behind the counter, typing with trembling fingers. She looked up at me, eyes ringed with worry. "Dr. Reyes had an emergency call at the hospital," she explained, barely meeting my gaze. "I'm afraid he won't be back until late this afternoon." I wanted to shout in frustration, but held back. My mouth was still throbbing. I could taste fresh blood on my tongue. She handed me a pad of gauze, and I pressed it gently to the swollen gap. A question burned in my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to voice it. Had other people been showing up with missing teeth? When I left the clinic, I started noticing the heavy silence in the street. It was morning, yet hardly anyone was out. Most windows were shut tight, and curtains drawn as if people were hiding. A flicker of movement caught my eye, a shadow darting behind a parked car. I stopped, heart pounding. Standing perfectly still, I listened. No footsteps, no breathing, just the shuffle of leaves behind me. Then, just as I was about to turn away, a figure emerged. It was a man in a threadbare coat, head bowed, shoulders hunched. He shuffled across the sidewalk, disappearing around the corner. I felt a prickling sense of dread. There was something off about the way he moved, like he was stalking the pavement itself. My mind raced, conjuring absurd possibilities. Could he have stolen my tooth? It sounded ridiculous. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered long after he vanished. As I continued home, I passed Mrs. Montoya's house. Her front door was slightly ajar, and I heard soft, muted whispers inside, like someone pleading. I hesitated, then took a step onto her porch, but a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut in my face. The impact rattled my teeth, what remained of them, and I stumbled back, shaken. I decided to hurry home, ignoring the questions swirling in my mind. Something told me that we were all in terrible danger. That night, sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw red-stained sheets and felt the raw gap in my gums. Eventually, exhaustion conquered my fear, and my lids grew heavy. But just as I was slipping into uneasy dreams, a scraping sound jolted me awake. My heart thundered in my ears. At first, I thought it was coming from the hallway, but then I realized it came from above, somewhere in the attic. I held my breath, waiting. The sound resumed, slow and deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. I forced myself out of bed, every nerve screaming for me to stay put. With trembling hands, I flicked on the flashlight app on my phone. Its weak beam wavered against the dark walls. Step by step, I made my way to the hallway, which was cold as a tomb. The attic's pull-down ladder creaked loudly as I tugged it open. Part of me hoped I was imagining everything. But the second I peered up into the darkness, I sensed a presence. A slight shift in the air. I could almost feel eyes looking back at me, hidden in the gloom. I nearly dropped my phone in terror. Slowly, I aimed the trembling light around the attic. Boxes and old furniture cast long, menacing shadows. The scraping sound had stopped. There was no sign of movement, no intruder in sight. Yet the feeling that someone had been there was overwhelming. I backed down the ladder, adrenaline rushing through my veins. Before I closed it, I noticed something glinting on one of the rafters. A small, white fragment. Carefully, I reached up to grab it. Even in the faint light, I recognized it instantly. The broken half of a human tooth. Suddenly, I felt as though I couldn't breathe. My veins turned to ice as I lowered the attic door, locking that horrifying possibility upstairs. Whatever had stolen my tooth, or maybe someone else's, had been hiding just above my head. By the following morning, the word was out. People across the neighborhood had woken up to find swollen gums and missing teeth. It wasn't everyone, but it was enough to fuel a collective panic. The police set up a temporary post near the main street. Patrol cars rolled slowly past houses, spotlights scanning yards and alleyways. I ventured outside, fueled by equal parts curiosity and dread. Neighbors who never spoke to one another now huddled together in hushed conversations. Mrs. Montoya was among them, jaw wrapped in bandages. Her eyes were hollow, skin clammy. She looked at me with a pleading expression, as if I had answers. Whispers floated through the small crowd. "It can't be human. The cops can't protect us." I heard it moves on all fours. Each rumor was more outrageous than the last. But the one detail everyone agreed on was the blood. Puddles of it on pillows, splatters on floors, dribbles leading out back doors. A local news van showed up, broadcasting live updates. As I passed them, the reporter signaled me over. For a moment, I debated speaking on camera, but my throat felt tight with apprehension. I just shook my head and walked away, ignoring the microphone thrust in my face. We didn't realize it yet, but our community was being stalked. The missing teeth weren't random. They followed some grim pattern, though none of us knew what that pattern was. The only certainty was that each new morning brought another horrifying discovery. I overheard the police discussing footprints, sharp imprints in the mud around certain houses, too large for any wild animal we knew. The lead officer dismissed them as a prank, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't believe his own words, and still the figure in the threadbare coat haunted my thoughts. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw him limping through the empty streets, pockets bulging with stolen teeth. Sleep was impossible. My aching jaw wouldn't let me forget the grim reality. Instead, I spent the night rummaging through my old belongings in the basement, looking for anything that might distract me. That's when I found my grandfather's worn leather notebook, a journal he'd kept decades ago, filled with odd sketches and cryptic entries. Settling on a dusty stool, I flipped through the pages. At first, the writing seemed unrelated, old folklore, local legends about ghost lights in the marsh. But near the end, my grandfather had scrawled something about the Tooth Man. I froze, rereading the paragraph until every word burned in my mind. Some say the Tooth Man is an omen of an ancient curse, drawn to towns with hidden rot. People wake with teeth missing, as if the spirit is collecting pieces of their souls through their mouths. No one ever sees it clearly, just the edges of a figure in a coat, drifting through darkness. Then come the nightmares. Each sentence felt like a jigsaw piece sliding into place, unveiling a horrifying picture. Fear clung to my skin like a damp fog. Was I dealing with an old urban legend come to life? Or had my grandfather scribbled down the product of his own nightmares? I swallowed hard, teeth on edge. My memory flickered to the attic and that broken tooth fragment. If my grandfather's journal was right, this entity or person was no ordinary intruder. It was something ancient, malevolent, and cunning enough to operate unseen. A dread deeper than anything I'd known settled in my bones. Yet, reading about the Tooth Man gave me a bizarre sense of relief. At least now there was a name for this horror. A thin thread to cling to in the face of the unimaginable. I pressed my back against the cold basement wall, the journal shaking in my hands. If the stories were true, we were dealing with an evil that preys on fear. And right now, our town was marinating in terror. Determined not to be a helpless victim again, I decided to stay awake through the night. I barricaded every door and window with furniture, set up makeshift alarms, pots and pans balanced on doorknobs. Anything to create noise if someone tried to break in. I brewed enough coffee to keep me wired for hours. The quiet of the house was unbearable. Each creak of the floor or rustle of the wind outside made my heart skip a beat. To distract myself, I read more of the journal by the flickering light of a table lamp. Midnight came and went in uneasy silence. By 2 a.m., my eyes were burning, but I refused to let them close. I climbed the stairs to check the attic door, perfectly shut. No more scraping sounds. Yet, then, around 3 a.m., I heard faint footsteps on the front porch. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I reached for the baseball bat I'd placed beside the door. A timid knock followed, like someone too weak or terrified to knock properly. I inched closer, heart thudding. Through the peephole, I saw a frail figure. It was Mrs. Montoya. She looked disoriented, her face drawn and ashen. I opened the door with trembling hands, letting in a gust of cold night air. "Please," she whispered, voice trembling. "He's out there. He wants more." I ushered her inside and locked the door. She crumpled onto the couch, clutching her bandaged jaw. A fresh stain of blood was seeping through the gauze. "He followed me," she gasped. "I saw him from my window. The coat, the pockets, they were dripping red." A chill slithered up my spine. She could barely speak, her tongue struggling over swollen gums. I offered her water, but she just shook her head, wincing in pain. I realized with dawning horror that more of her teeth were missing. Her mouth was a ruin of blood and fear. The notion that the collector of teeth was lurking outside my home at that very moment was almost too much to bear. But I had to remain calm, for both our sakes. I gave Mrs. Montoya a blanket and tried to soothe her shaking shoulders. Her eyes darted toward the windows every few seconds, as if expecting the figure to burst inside at any moment. It wasn't long before I heard another sound, a scraping at the back door. My stomach lurched. "He's here." Gripping the bat, I tiptoed through the kitchen, blood pounding in my ears. Slowly, I peered through the blinds. First, I saw nothing, but then the porch light flickered, casting a strobing effect on the backyard. And there he was, a tall silhouette in a long, tattered coat. The brim of a hat or hood concealed his face. He stood motionless, as if listening. My legs trembled. I fought the urge to bolt. In that flickering light, I could swear I saw the lumps in his coat's pockets shift, like small creatures squirming. Then, in a heartbeat, he vanished into the darkness, as though he'd never been there at all. Adrenaline surged. I locked the back door and slid to the floor, breathing fast and shallow. My mind raced with questions. What does he want beyond the teeth? Why is he targeting us? I returned to the living room. Mrs. Montoya was barely conscious, eyes half-lidded in terror. Her muffled groans told me she was slipping into shock. I checked her bandages, new blood seeped through. Whoever had taken her teeth wasn't gentle. My phone buzzed, startling me. I fumbled to answer. It was the police department's automated alert system. Lock doors. Stay inside. Curfew in effect until further notice. They hadn't caught him. They were just warning people to hide. Mrs. Montoya whimpered, her breath rattling in her chest. I had never felt so helpless. The only shred of comfort was that we were not alone. Someone else was bearing witness to this horror. But that comfort paled in comparison to the suffocating dread that grew heavier by the minute. When dawn finally broke, a heavy fog blanketed the town. It was eerie, like the sun was reluctant to shine on us. The curfew was lifted, but few dared to leave their homes. Mrs. Montoya had drifted into a fitful sleep on my couch, her moans punctuating the silence. My thoughts drifted back to Grandpa's journal. I rummaged through the entries again, hoping to find some clue. One passage leapt out. If the tooth man sets his sights on you, avoid being alone. He's drawn to isolation, thrives on fear. Doors mean nothing, walls only stall him. But if you band together, sometimes it disrupts his pattern. Strength in numbers, if only temporary. I realized I needed help. More than just the police who seemed powerless. Maybe if the neighbors joined forces, we could protect each other. That desperate logic spurred me to action. Leaving Mrs. Montoya snoring softly under a blanket, I headed outside to rally anyone willing to come out. Along the sidewalk, a few frightened faces peered from half-closed doors. Mr. Liu, a retired librarian, stepped onto his porch, eyes weary yet determined. Next door, teenage twins, Malik and Mara, clutched each other's hands, scanning the street warily. I told them about my attic discovery, Mrs. Montoya's condition, the sightings of that coat-wearing phantom. If we don't want to end up toothless or worse, we need to stick together, I said. My voice trembled, but I forced the words out. Reluctantly, they agreed. We formed a small circle by the curb, exchanging phone numbers and planning how to keep watch. Mr. Liu offered his home's basement as a meeting point. It had thick walls and heavy doors. He joked it used to be a bomb shelter. None of us laughed. As we dispersed, I noticed a subtle shift in the air. Fear was still thick, but there was also a glimmer of solidarity. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a shred of hope, fragile as a loose tooth, but real enough to cling to. That evening, as dusk fell, I helped Mrs. Montoya hobble to Mr. Liu's basement. The teenage twins joined us, along with a few other neighbors who couldn't bear another night alone. We secured the doors, checked the small windows, and huddled in a circle of flickering lamps. We shared our stories. One man had awakened to find a molar gone. Another woman had lost 2 incisors in one night. Some said they sensed a presence hovering over them in their sleep, like the weight of a creature crouching on their chest. A sudden buzz from my phone shattered the tense quiet. My signal was weak, but a text message from an unknown number got through. I have information. Meet me near the old bus station at midnight. Come alone. I stared at the text, my heart pounding. It felt like a trap, but curiosity gnawed at me. What if this is a chance to learn how to stop him? The others urged caution. You can't go alone, Mr. Liu insisted, setting down his mug of tea so forcefully that hot liquid spilled onto the concrete floor. That's what it wants, for you to be vulnerable. But something in me refused to let this lead slip away. I'll be careful, I promised, though my own voice shook. If it's a trick, at least we'll know. If it's real information, we might finally have an advantage. An uneasy silence followed. Eventually, the group agreed I could go, but only if I kept my phone GPS on and checked in constantly. We set up a plan. If I sent a distress code, they'd come for me immediately. As the clock approached midnight, I slipped out of the basement, bracing myself against the chilly air. The streets were unnaturally quiet. No cars, no street noise, just the whisper of wind through skeletal branches. In the distance, a single street lamp flickered, as if struggling to stay alive. I clutched Grandpa's journal in my jacket pocket, praying I wasn't walking into the jaws of the very nightmare I was trying to escape. The old bus station was a derelict ruin, long abandoned and covered in graffiti. My footsteps echoed off the cracked pavement as I ventured under the broken awning. Shadows stretched across the platform, dancing in the pale moonlight. I waited, breath clouding in the cold air. Minutes ticked by in agonizing silence. Then a voice hissed from behind a rusted vending machine. Over here. Stepping closer, I found a man hunched over, wearing a ragged hoodie. He looked gaunt, eyes sunken into dark sockets. A strong odor of sweat and desperation clung to him. My stomach churned as he extended his hands. They were shaking, fingers stained with dried blood. You want to stop him? He rasped, glancing nervously around. I've seen him, followed him. Who are you? I asked, forcing myself to keep my voice steady. Jeremiah, he replied, had the misfortune of crossing his path 2 towns over. He opened his mouth, revealing jagged gaps where teeth should be. He takes them, collects them. Don't matter how. You fight back, you lose more. A chill shot through me. Why does he do it? Is he human? Jeremiah let out a hollow laugh that turned into a hacking cough. He's something else. Something old and hungry. He reached into his pocket, retrieving a small slip of paper. On it were symbols, intricate lines forming a circle around what looked like a fanged mouth. He hates this, Jeremiah whispered, thrusting the paper at me. Found it in a library book on the occult. Don't know if it'll stop him, but I used it to keep him off my trail. Until now, his eyes darted to the station's entrance, and my pulse spiked. Was he here? My phone suddenly vibrated. A text from Mr. Liu, checking in. I typed a quick, okay, and turned back to Jeremiah, but he was already limping away, disappearing around a dark corner. Clutching the slip of paper, I stuffed it into Grandpa's journal. Relief warred with dread as I realized I might have a weapon, however small, against the collector. But midnight was not a safe time to linger. I hurried back, adrenaline buzzing in my veins. As soon as I returned to Mr. Liu's basement, everyone crowded around me. I showed them the symbol Jeremiah had given me, drawn in shaky lines on a wrinkled scrap. Anxiety flickered across each face. I've seen something like that before, Mr. Liu said, adjusting his glasses. In an old reference book about folk rituals, some cultures believe symbols can ward off evil spirits. Though my mind screamed that this was all too surreal, I couldn't deny that we were dealing with something beyond conventional logic. We decided to replicate the symbol. Using markers, we scrawled it on sheets of paper, taped it to windows and doors, hoping it might provide some protection. Mrs. Montoya looked skeptical, though pain had rendered her nearly mute. The twins were frightened but determined, their youthful boldness flickering beneath the surface of dread. Around 3 a.m., the tension in the basement became suffocating. Every creak from upstairs made us jump. The heavy air pressed on us, thick with the promise of danger. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the kitchen above. Everyone froze. Mr. Liu armed himself with a hammer, and I grabbed a flashlight. Heart pounding, we crept upstairs in a small group. The back door was splintered, hanging ajar. Outside, the yard was silent, illuminated by a ghostly moon. The symbol we'd taped to the door was torn, its ink smeared with blood. My chest tightened at the sight of fresh droplets leading into the darkness beyond the lawn. Had the collector tried to break in, only to recoil at the sign? Or was it just a cruel message that nothing could truly stop him? Returning to the basement, we triple-locked the interior doors. But sleep was no longer an option. The knowledge that our flimsy wards had been challenged so swiftly made my stomach churn. The feeling of danger was more palpable than ever, slithering through every shadowy corner of our makeshift sanctuary. By dawn, the house felt like a fortress under siege. We had to face the possibility that our survival depended on more than ancient symbols. We decided to involve the police more directly, so I phoned the station and demanded they send officers to inspect the damaged door. 2 officers arrived shortly, an older sergeant with graying temples and a rookie who could barely hide his nerves. They walked through the house, noting the symbols, the splintered wood, the blood stains. But skepticism hung in their eyes. It could be a deranged person breaking in, the sergeant said, though his tone implied he didn't fully believe that. We'll file a report and increase patrols. Lock your doors and stay together. I pressed him, telling him about Jeremiah's warning, about the strange footprints, about the old legend in Grandpa's journal. The sergeant exchanged a glance with the rookie. Their silence spoke volumes. They had no real plan to confront something so inexplicable. We have a lead, the rookie offered quietly. A man found unconscious downtown. Says he saw someone rummaging through trash bins for used dental gear. My mind flashed to the collector, pockets stuffed with extracted teeth. A sick sensation curled in my gut. He's not just collecting random teeth. He's scouring any source he can find. As the officers left, they promised to inform the mayor's office and coordinate with neighboring districts. Their hollow reassurances felt more like a courtesy than a genuine solution. I watched their patrol car pull away, swallowed by the thickening fog. The sinking feeling in my stomach grew. We were dealing with a relentless force that the police, with all their caution and authority, couldn't fully comprehend or handle. Even so, I clung to the faint hope that a coordinated effort might disrupt the collector's insidious hunts. Even with extra patrols, another victim was discovered by morning. An older man 3 blocks away, found barely conscious in his own backyard. His lips and chin were smeared with blood, multiple teeth missing. He remembered only a suffocating weight on his chest, a rancid breath on his face, and a raspy voice whispering, "Give them to me." The news sent shockwaves through our group. We realized staying in Mr. Liu's basement might not guarantee safety forever. But for now, it seemed our best option. We fortified the walls with anything we could find. Wooden planks, metal sheets, and prayed it would be enough. That night, I kept the symbol by my side, as though I could will it to ward off evil. I was dozing in a corner when a thunderous crash upstairs jolted everyone awake. A terrible howling sound followed, primal and enraged. I grabbed the flashlight and sprinted up the stairs, the others trailing behind. The front door was wide open, battered off its hinges. Furniture we'd stacked had been tossed aside like twigs. A gaping hole in the window let in the cold night air. Through the broken glass, I spotted him, tall, angular silhouette in the moonlight. A wave of revulsion and terror hit me. His coat looked darker than the shadows, each pocket bulging with small lumps that seemed to shift and stir. He glanced back at us, revealing a partial face twisted in madness. In that split second, I saw something clutched in his gloved hand, white shards that caught the moonlight. Teeth. Then, with a bestial speed, he fled. We rushed outside, but he was gone, leaving only footprints in the wet grass and a scattering of broken teeth behind. A neighbor's piercing scream tore through the darkness. We followed the sound to the side of the house, where we found Mara, the teenage girl, collapsed in shock. Her brother hovered over her, tears streaming down his cheeks. I shone my flashlight on her mouth, empty spaces where her front teeth had been. She trembled, unable to speak, eyes wide with horror. Mara's injuries rattled us all. The collector had breached our makeshift fortress with shocking ease, snatching her teeth before we could react. Our attempts at fortification and symbols seemed laughable now. Over the next few hours, we tried to comfort Mara. She mumbled incoherently, tears mingling with blood. Her brother Malik stayed by her side, torn between anger and despair. Meanwhile, Mr. Liu gathered supplies, bandages, antiseptics, anything to treat her wounds. "We can't stay here," I whispered to him. "He can get in no matter what we do." He nodded grimly. "Where do we go? The whole town is under his shadow." I thought about Jeremiah's words. He's drawn to isolation. Maybe if we escaped the town entirely, we'd dilute the fear he was feeding on. But leaving also meant traveling through dark roads, where he could pick us off one by one. In a burst of desperate energy, I paced the living room, scanning Grandpa's journal again. Another passage caught my eye. In some villages, they lured the creature with a mock offering, then trapped it in a sacred space. Fire was their final recourse, burned the place to purify it. The idea was terrifying and extreme. But if the collector was some manifestation of ancient evil, maybe it was the only way to stop him. Could we trap him? Voicing the plan to the group was met with fear and skepticism. Yet no one offered a better solution. We decided that our best shot was the abandoned church near the old cemetery, a stone structure that might still have the aura of sanctity. If we could lure him inside, maybe we could lock him in and burn it down. It sounded like a suicide mission, but helplessness gave birth to boldness. We prepared a van and gathered anything flammable: gasoline cans, oil-soaked rags, matches. The plan was simple. Use ourselves as bait, draw him into the church and set it ablaze. There was no guarantee it would work or that we'd survive. But if we did nothing, our fates were sealed, tooth by tooth. Night fell as we loaded into Mr. Liu's old van. Mara lay in the back, half conscious, while Malik clutched her hand protectively. Mrs. Montoya was silent, eyes distant. A few other neighbors, those we could convince to join us, piled in. The rest stayed behind, either too terrified or resigned to their fate. As we drove through the deserted streets, broken streetlights cast sporadic flashes of light. Each flicker made me tense, expecting to see that dreadful silhouette skulking by the roadside. The fog thickened, swallowing the beam of our headlights. We passed the local pharmacy, its windows shattered. Red droplets stained the sidewalk. A sense of dread curled in my gut at the thought of more victims lying just out of sight. We had no time to investigate. Our plan hinged on urgency. When the van finally rolled to a stop in front of the abandoned church, the building loomed before us like a dark sentinel. Its tall, crumbling spire scratched at the night sky. We quickly unloaded, stepping over gravestones hidden in knee-high weeds. The cemetery around us felt like it belonged to another realm, silent and watchful. Inside, the church smelled of mildew and old wood. Rows of broken pews lay scattered, moonlight filtering through shattered stained glass windows. We spread out to inspect the space, the crunch of debris echoing. "Over here," Mr. Liu called softly, pointing to a tall set of iron gates behind the altar, possibly leading to a storage area. If we lured him there, we might close the gates and trap him. Everyone nodded, though fear flickered in their eyes. We prepared the trap with trembling hands, placing gasoline cans around the perimeter. Someone coughed, the sound too loud in the oppressive hush. The plan was horrifyingly simple. Lure the collector inside, lock the gates, ignite the gasoline. My pulse pounded with dread and determination. This had to work. We needed to draw the collector in, and for that we needed live bait. The others turned to me, and I found myself nodding, even though panic flared in my chest. I was the one who first encountered him, the one who still had Grandpa's journal. It made a twisted sort of sense that I'd be his prime target. We decided I'd wait in the main aisle of the church, alone and vulnerable, while the others hid near the iron gates with cans of gasoline and matches. The plan hinged on the collector fixating on me long enough for everyone else to launch the ambush. Heart hammering, I stood near the shattered altar, flashlight off, letting the moonlight highlight my silhouette. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to remain steady, inhaling the stale air that reeked of dust and rot. Minutes dragged by, my ears strained for any sign of him. A footstep, a rasping breath. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft drip of water seeping through the old roof. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I glimpsed a shape moving through a broken window. Slowly, he slid inside with an eerie grace that made my skin crawl. A tall figure in that ragged coat, pockets bulging ominously. Even from a distance, I sensed his eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. I swallowed hard, resisting the urge to bolt. We locked gazes, and I felt an icy dread clamp down on my lungs. Something about his stare felt inhuman, like peering into the void. He inched closer, each step impossibly silent. My heart thundered so loudly I was sure he could hear it. As his hand emerged from the coat pocket, I glimpsed multiple teeth rolling across his palm, some still dripping blood. My stomach lurched. A thunderous crash echoed from the choir stalls. Mr. Liu had kicked over a pew, signaling the ambush. The collector's head snapped toward the sound. For a second, I thought he would vanish into the darkness. Instead, he lunged forward, quicker than thought, heading straight for me. My scream tore through the ancient walls as the collector's hand clamped around my arm. Pain shot through me, and I felt my jaw tighten, terrified he'd force my mouth open. But then, in a frantic scramble, I broke free, stumbling toward the iron gates. Mr. Liu and the others sprang from their hiding places, dousing the area with gasoline. A foul stench filled the air. I dove behind an overturned pew, adrenaline roaring in my veins. The collector whirled around, eyes burning with rage, or was it hunger? He lunged at Mr. Liu, but the man darted away at the last second. Malik lit a rag with trembling hands, tossing it onto a trail of gasoline. The flames erupted in a bright flash, forcing the collector to recoil with an unearthly hiss. He staggered, coat catching the edges of the flame. Yet he didn't flee. Instead, he moved like a wounded animal, cornered but deadly. With a sudden burst of impossible strength, he hurled a broken pew toward us, smashing into the church's columns. The impact sent splinters flying, one slicing across my cheek. I ducked, tasting blood and smoke. The flames spread, licking up the wooden beams and casting wild shadows on the stained glass shards. The sound of crackling timber filled the nave as thick smoke billowed toward the rafters. "Drive him to the gates," I shouted, voice ragged. We herded him like hunters cornering a beast, using the fire to corral him toward the iron enclosure. The heat was intense, sweat pouring down my face. He struggled, thrashing against the spreading inferno. For a moment, he locked eyes with me again. In that scorching glow, I thought I saw something almost human in his gaze. A flicker of fear? Or was it cunning? With a violent twist, he broke away from the flames, heading straight for the side exit. "No!" Malik yelled, sprinting forward. Before any of us could stop him, he tackled the collector, both of them crashing into a smoldering pew. Sparks flew, and a wave of blazing heat engulfed them. A chorus of panicked cries erupted. Malik and the collector vanished behind the roaring flames. We rushed forward, but the heat forced us back. Smoke choked the air, stinging our eyes. I shouted Malik's name, coughing and stumbling. Suddenly, from within the inferno, something burst free. The collector, coat ablaze, staggered across the floor, howling in a voice that sounded less than human. I caught a glimpse of Malik's limp form dragged across the burning wood. I wanted to lunge in, to save him, but the wall of fire was impenetrable. A deafening groan shook the building as a fiery beam crashed from the ceiling, separating us from the collector and Malik. Flames raced along the floor, blocking every path. In the chaos, Mr. Liu grabbed my arm, pulling me away. We had to escape before the entire structure collapsed. "Malik!" Mara shrieked from somewhere in the thick smoke, her voice ragged. I clutched her wrist, dragging her toward the nearest exit. She fought me at first, tears streaming, but there was nothing we could do. We tumbled outside into the cold night. Several others managed to escape, coughing and shuddering. Flames roared behind us, lighting the sky with an orange glow. Embers fell like fiery rain over the neglected gravestones. From a safe distance, we watched the inferno consume the church. The heat pressed against our backs, sweat mingling with ash and tears. Each second felt like a small eternity. After what seemed like hours, the roof collapsed with a final, thunderous crash, sending sparks spiraling into the starless sky. Silence settled over us, broken only by the crackle of dying flames. We sank to the ground, exhausted, some sobbing, others too numb for tears. The plan had been reckless, but it was our last hope. We had no idea if the collector or even Malik had survived that hellish blaze. An unsettling calm followed the church's destruction. Dazed and covered in soot, we gathered near the van. Mara stared at the burning ruins in silent shock, her tear-streaked face lit by flickering embers. Mr. Liu murmured broken apologies, though none of this was truly his fault. One by one, we took a grim head count. Malik was gone, along with two others who'd entered the church but never made it out. Guilt gnawed at me. It was my plan, after all. But I forced myself to stand, to see if the nightmare was really over. Dawn crept over the horizon, pale light illuminating the charred remains. Smoke still drifted in hazy tendrils. We combed the perimeter, searching for any sign of the collector or our lost friends. All we found were ashes and twisted metal. A strange hush enveloped the area. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the world was deciding whether to grant us a reprieve. Part of me dared to hope that, in its final act, the fire had destroyed the collector for good. But the memory of his inhuman resilience haunted me. I kept replaying the moment he burst out of the flames, coat ablaze, unwilling to die. Could something so tenacious truly be consumed by the fire? In a heartbreaking moment, Mara sank to her knees, grasping a charred piece of wood. "He saved us," she whispered, voice trembling. "Malik? He saved us." Tears coursed down her cheeks. All I could do was place a hand on her shoulder, my own eyes burning with sorrow and uncertainty. Mr. Liu slowly handed me Grandpa's journal, singed around the edges but still intact. I tucked it away, unsure if I ever wanted to read it again. For the moment, we clung to the faint possibility that we had ended the horror, even if it cost us more than we could bear. A week passed. No new reports of stolen teeth emerged. Neighbors tentatively emerged from their homes, nursing their wounds, both physical and emotional. The police concluded the church fire was an unfortunate accident, though rumors circulated about a man in a coat spotted near the cemetery. I spent those days drifting in and out of half-hopeful denial, telling myself the collector had perished in the blaze. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw him lunging through the flames, unstoppable. Then, early one morning, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My blood ran cold as I read. Still hungry, my heart pounded. Could be a sick prank, or proof that the evil we faced was not gone. Panicking, I ran to the bathroom and checked my reflection. My own face stared back, pale with fear, teeth intact, except one lower molar felt loose. As I touched it, a fresh pang of pain flared. Blood pooled under my tongue. Trembling, I dabbed at my gums. A single droplet of crimson hit the sink, swirling in the water. I stared at it, a mix of terror and resignation washing over me. The collector might have been wounded, but he was alive. He had marked me again. I quickly grabbed my packed bag, money, clothes, the battered journal, and headed for the door. There was no time to warn the others. I had to flee before nightfall, to run as far from this cursed town as possible. Perhaps distance would slow his pursuit, give me a chance to figure out another plan, if there was one. But as I stepped onto the porch, a shiver of hopelessness coursed through my body. He always finds what he wants, and he wanted our teeth, fragments of our very being. I locked the door behind me and walked away, the taste of blood lingering on my tongue. No matter where I went or how fast I ran, the memory of that twisted figure in the threadbare coat would forever haunt me. Because in the end, I knew one terrible truth. He would never stop collecting.